Okay, everybody, can I be heard clearly? I hope that everyone can hear me. It's wonderful to be here with you at this MirYam Institute situational briefing. Thank you to all of our guests. We're delighted to be joined by Professor Avi Bell, by Colonel Hacham, and by our in-house analyst, Yaakov Lappin. I want to thank my colleagues at the MirYam Institute for their time, and thank you all of you for tuning in and for being part of this briefing. We're going to get right to it. This program will last for about 75 minutes. Our first guest that we'd want to focus on is Professor Avi Bell. He's the professor of law at Ilan University and the University of San Diego. Professor, thank you very much for being with us. For our audience's situational awareness, we're going to begin with a focus on the ICJ and the recent ruling that came out of the ICJ. Thereafter, we're going to move on to Colonel Hacham of the IDF Reserves and to Yaakov Lappin to talk about the situational standing of Israel's operation and also some of the diplomatic efforts that are underway, as well as some of the hostage release efforts that are being negotiated at this time. So, Professor, thank you again for being with us. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Great. And may I call you Avi?
Of course.
Wonderful. Great to be with you, Avi. So I wanted to begin with a very basic question right at the top of this. There is an understandable contempt shown by the pro-Israel community to many international organizations because of this predisposition that they have towards the state of Israel in a negative sense. We hear this when it comes to the United Nations. We hear this certainly when it comes to the ICJ. And in the context of the ICJ, I'd like to begin with a very basic question. What compelled Israel to defend the charges that South Africa brought?
Well, I actually, before I answer that, let me just say, I'm not sure that it's correct to say that there's a contempt in the pro-Israel crowd for these international institutions. I think it's quite the reverse. I think that international institutions like the ICJ and the UN have a great deal of contempt for Israel and for the Jewish people. And there are some in the pro-Israel community who notice that the spittle on their face is not rain, that it's actually coming from those organizations. But when we ask why did Israel participate, I think it's because Israel, unfortunately, takes these matters much too seriously. Now, let me just say, the ICJ is it's the court of the UN. It shares the biases of the UN, and like the UN, for the most part, it can't do very much besides talk. And so it can issue rulings, but even when it does, and even if they're formally legally binding, nothing happens. In this case, South Africa has brought a claim that's designed primarily to sell a narrative. It's designed to sell a narrative that Hamas is not the evil party here, and it's not countries like South Africa that provide material support to Hamas. No, the wrongdoer here is Israel and its citizens who were murdered by Hamas. And the reason Israel participated, there's a good reason and a bad reason. There's a good reason to participate, which is once you see that this process is going, it's important to try in some way to shape and take control of the narrative. And Israel partially did that. Right, and so this part is good. The other part of this, unfortunately, is that there are people in Israel who actually take seriously the ICJ's formal jurisdiction. And according to the ICJ, it has jurisdiction in this case because since South Africa claims that Israel is committing genocide, and since Israel is a party to the Genocide Treaty, and since the Genocide Treaty says the ICJ has jurisdiction, then Israel formally is required to give answers for itself. Now, I think that it's not a wise thing to participate for that reason, but I do think there's value in participating where Israel can take control of the narrative.
So when you say that we take it too seriously, is that because of the lack of enforceability?
I think that we take it too seriously because it's not an institution of law at all, really. It's a political institution. And so it's not simply the fact that it lacks the ability to enforce its judgments. It does, but it's also because it's an institution that does not deserve our respect. It does not to be treated as if it's issuing rulings from law. It should be treated as a political institution and one that is biased against Israel. I have to say, Israel is not the only country that's recognized this. About 6 years ago, the United States went through a series of withdrawals from treaties in order to strip away the ICJ's jurisdiction in different kinds of cases. A lot of countries in the world have had no choice but to recognize that the ICJ is political and also that it has no enforcement power. And so that's why it's not just countries like Russia that ignore the rulings of the ICJ. It's also countries like the United States and Britain and many other countries that have found themselves in the political target sites of the ICJ.
Professor, how do you think Israel acquitted itself in its pleadings before the ICJ? We saw Tal Becker and his colleagues make a very forceful argument to have the charges by South Africa dismissed. They weren't dismissed, obviously, but how do you think our argumentation went?
I think that the right way to judge this is, again, to understand who it is we're talking to, right? So the reason for Malcolm Shaw and for Tal Becker and company to appear before the court is not to make legal arguments to the court in the hope of persuading them, because that's simply naive to believe that Israel can in any way shape the outcome. I think the reason to stand up before the court to make arguments is to speak to the rest of the world, to speak to that part of the world which is not already biased against Israel, and that part of the world that recognizes what the ICJ is, and to point out to them what a farce this proceeding is. And I think that the representation of Israel did very well in that regard. I think that they did a good job in highlighting how absurd it is that the allies of perpetrators of horrible war crimes and atrocities, including genocidal acts, their allies are bringing a lawsuit against the people they're trying to kill. And the victims are being made to answer for themselves. It's quite an absurd situation. That said, I have to say there's another piece to Israel's participation, and that is Israel's right as a state that's been sued to appoint an ad hoc judge to join the panel of judges in the ICJ. And here I think Israel did less well. We can see that the ruling of the Israeli judge was not, I don't think it was quite favorable to Israel. At least it was less favorable to Israel than, for example,
Aaron Barak you're referring to.
Yes, Aaron Barak's ruling on preliminary measures was less favorable to Israel than, for example, the ruling of the justice from Uganda, which is quite ironic. But worse, I think that it was not loyal to the law, because it's simply not possible, I think, to acknowledge the absence of legal merit in the South African claims and then to nevertheless join in ordering Israel to take preliminary measures. There are no measures that the victim owes to allies of the perpetrators, but yet that's exactly what Aaron Barak did. He joined 2 of the 5 preliminary measures that were ordered by the court. And I think that's very damaging to Israel and to its reputation.
So let's talk about that for a moment, because I agree with you. I think that it was damaging. There was a storm in Israel somewhat in relevant circles about his being appointed to that position of being an ad hoc judge there. What do you think the thinking was behind his appointment? And also, incidentally, for those of us who are less familiar with the process, can you explain to us precisely the role of an ad hoc judge? And are you surprised? These are 3 questions. So what went into his being appointed an ad hoc judge? Are you surprised by the fact that he was, and what do you think? What exactly is the function of an ad hoc judge, please?
Right. So the way the ICJ works is it has generally 15 judges that all sit together. I have to say, it wasn't originally planned that all the 15 judges would sit together, but the ICJ has had a tough time getting states to agree to their jurisdiction. And so the ICJ doesn't have a case that warrants sitting in smaller panels. So the 15 judges generally sit together, and in those cases where it's a contentious case between states, each of the states may appoint an ad hoc judge if there isn't already a judge of their nationality on the court. Now, in February, a South African judge will be coming in, but there's never been an Israeli judge on the court, and there never will be, because the judges are selected by the UN. And as I said, the ICJ shares the UN's biases against Israel, so there will never be an Israeli judge. This is the only way Israel will ever have a judge, is ad hoc. Now, what's the point of appointing an ad hoc judge? It's to make sure that at least one judge is able to give the legal perspective, and I don't mean a political perspective, but a legal perspective from the viewpoint of the state that's being charged or that's bringing charges. Now, the judges are still judges. That is, they're expected to sit and hear evidence and then issue a ruling according to their best legal judgment. But obviously, these issues are always contested, and it is expected that they're going to be particularly attentive to the need to express the legal side that may be less heard, the legal side of their state. Now, that's not what happened with Aaron Barak. I think that Aaron Barak's opinion reflected a desire to, well, I'll just say that the first parts of the first third of his opinion is about Aaron Barak and about Aaron Barak as a judge in Israel. And the first 7 out of 21 footnotes are citations to writings by Barak, his law review articles, and his judgments. And I think you can get a sense of what it is that Barak was trying to accomplish by being an ad hoc judge. And so, yes, I was very surprised by the selection of Barak. I think that this was entirely predictable. I think that the reason that he was selected was out of a mistake, out of a failure to understand what kind of institution the ICJ is. The ICJ, again, is a political institution. It's not a legal institution. And the thought was, maybe if Israel appoints somebody with a reputation, a worldwide reputation as a judge, Israeli claims will get a more attentive hearing. But of course they won't. The ICJ is not a neutral institution. It's a politicized institution, and there is no chance that Israel's claims would ever get a real hearing. And I'll add that appointing a judge like Barak means that nobody's even going to represent that cases in the judges' chambers, because Aaron Barak does not see himself as a representative of Israel. He sees himself as a judge. And that means that he's detached and pursuing, at best, an objective legal agenda, but at worst, a personal agenda.
And he expressed as much. He went to the trouble of expressing that he did not view himself as an agent of the states of Israel in this particular case.
That's correct. He said that in the end of his opinion. If anybody had missed it in the first part of the opinion, yes, when he said it explicitly at the end.
So let's turn a little bit to the ICC, which is separate and is also in The Hague. They are able to bring charges against individuals, and the ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, has opened cases against Israelis and against Palestinian terrorists. What are the implications of that process, and how do they differ from the lack of enforcement powers that the ICJ has?
Yeah, the ICC is a very, very different institution. It's different not in the sense that it's depoliticized, because the ICC is, if anything, even more political than the ICJ. But the ICC acts against individuals, and it can order their punishment. It can order them placed in jail. And occasionally the ICC does this. The ICC also has a problem that it has never had a workload that is very strenuous. And so it gets to an average of about one final conviction every year and a half, which is really shockingly unproductive. But the ICC ultimately can put people in jail. So it has a real life effect that the ICJ can never have. Now, it's a mistake, I think, to focus on Karim Khan, because the Palestinians have been running a strategy with the ICC for the better part of 2 decades, to get the ICC to charge Israeli defendants. And before Karim Khan even took office as the prosecutor of the ICC, the prior prosecutor had already opened up a full-fledged investigation, criminal investigation, regarding what she called, and they all call, the situation in Palestine, which has always been primarily aimed at charging Israelis with crimes, Israeli soldiers, Israeli elected leaders, Israelis of all kinds. And the claim of potential Palestinian defendants has always been window dressing. It's an anti-Israel move. That's why the Palestinians have been so eager to move it forward. And I think that that's still what we're seeing with Karim Khan. Now, the ICC, as opposed to the ICJ, clearly has no jurisdiction here. But the ICC doesn't care. Karim Khan doesn't care. And I think that it is a near certainty that at the end of the day, there will be charges filed against Israelis, and maybe as window dressing again, some charges against Palestinians that everyone knows will never be seen in court.
2 years ago, I traveled to South Africa. I know that there are Israelis, senior members of the Israeli establishment, who have had attempts of prosecution, arrest, and then prosecution and the universal jurisdiction. I fell into that complication several years ago when I traveled to South Africa. Are we going to see an uptick of universal jurisdiction being deployed against Israelis as they travel abroad? And does that in any way tie into the body of evidence that's drawn together by either the ICJ or the ICC?
I think the whole point of the ICJ proceedings is to feed campaigns of harassing and bringing false prosecutions against Israelis, as well as to whitewash Hamas. And so, yes, I think that the more the proceedings are seen as successful, the more likely it is that we're going to see follow-on charges against random Israelis, random Jews, for allegedly participating in crimes. Now, with the ICJ, it's really hard to figure out what to do, because the ICJ claims it has jurisdiction. It actually has a reasonable argument that it has jurisdiction. That is, if one takes seriously South Africa's claims. I do not, but if one does, then it involves the Genocide Convention. This is at least more of a claim than the ICC has. The ICC has no jurisdiction, but Israel nonetheless has repeatedly cooperated with Karim Khan in the hopes of getting Hamas defendants. This is something I don't understand, and particularly in the case of the ICC, non-cooperation has been a very successful strategy for other countries in derailing ICC prosecutions. And if Israel doesn't turn it around, what we are going to see is exactly what you fear. Random Israelis, random Jews around the world are going to be charged with non-crimes, not only to spread blood libels, but to harass individual Israelis, individual Jews, to make their lives more difficult, to make it more difficult for them to travel around the world.
How geared up do you think Israel is for such an eventuality? And incidentally, would the defense of those who are brought forward on charges, if they're brought forward on charges under universal jurisdiction because of the actions of the ICJ, is that in any way, shape, or form the responsibility of the Israeli government to defend or to present a defense for in an automatic sense? Or is that more that a defense counsel would be brought forward from the country in which the universal jurisdiction is being applied, the charges are being brought?
Israel doesn't have formal responsibility for them, but Israel does try to defend the victims of anti-Semitism around the world. And I think that anyone brought up on charges of universal jurisdiction is clearly the victim of anti-Semitism. But that said, I think that in most cases, as a matter of fact, in all cases, the best thing to do is simply not to allow these other countries or these other institutions to lay their hands on Israelis. I would not trust any country that entertains a nonsense lawsuit like Benjamin Anthony is responsible for war crimes simply by virtue of his citizenship or his former service in the IDF. This is not a country you're not going to get a fair trial. This is you're going to find yourself in a kangaroo court if it gets to a trial. And so the best defense for that is not to be there. Don't allow yourself to be in a situation like that. And if Israel finds that citizens abroad have been taken in this way, what it has to do is move immediately to try to get them released by whatever means are appropriate and necessary, lest they go to trial. Because I would not trust the fairness of any legal proceedings.
Avi, just a couple of final questions that I want to get through, and each one of them is complex, but I'm going to try and have you handle them in short order. The first thing that I wanted to ask is, it's about UNRWA. You have this expose, this uncovering or even announcing of what was known to many, that members of UNRWA, staff members of UNRWA, were involved in the October 7th massacre. And this is an organization that perpetuates the status of refugee upon anybody who is a descendant of pre-state of Israel, Palestine. How relevant is the legal mandate of UNRWA? I know that there are obviously problems diplomatically, there are problems militarily in the security sense, but just talk to me a bit about the legal mandate from the point of view of refugee status when it comes to that which UNRWA confers on anybody and everybody around the world, incidentally, not just in Judea and Samaria or the Gaza Strip, but wherever they may be.
I think that it's a mistake to look first at UNRWA as a legal institution, because what UNRWA is more or less a public relations arm for Palestinian terrorist organizations, a collaborator with terrorist organizations, and a jobs program for Palestinians, many of whom are terrorists. Now, the problems of UNRWA cooperation with Palestinian terrorist organizations has been known for decades. Former employees of UNRWA have blown the whistle on it. There has never been any change, and this is because it's very, very important to the Palestinians, and because allies of the Palestinians are willing to go along with the charade that it's a relief organization rather than an organization for laundering the passage of money and supplies to terrorists. Now, the definition that UNRWA uses for itself to hand out cards to Palestinians is it calls anybody who's a descendant of a Palestinian a, quote, Palestine refugee. Now, that doesn't come with any legal rights. In fact, it strips them of rights. According to the Refugee Convention, anyone who receives aid from UNRWA under Article 1.6 is not a refugee at all. They don't have any rights under the Refugee Convention. So it's like many things that the Palestinians do. It harms Palestinians as well as harming Israel, and you'll see that this actually has effect. So refugees, for example, from the Syrian war, were able to get assistance if they were non-Palestinians, but if they were Palestinians, they weren't refugees at all and were shoved aside. So it's not right to look at them as refugees. They're not refugees. The UNRWA calls them refugees for political purposes, but they're in fact unable to call on any of the rights of legal refugees.
Last two questions, Avi. The first one that I wanted to ask you was, I'd like to know about Israel's obligations to its own citizens under international law. And this is a difficult question for me to ask. But there is obviously aid that is being transferred into the Gaza Strip. right now as we speak. That aid, in the mindset of many, seems to be the result of international pressure upon the Israeli government, but also seems to be that which is propping up Hamas's abilities to survive. And Hamas is the organization, terror organization, as we know, that is holding hostages and that is killing our soldiers. Is Israel in adherence to its own legal obligations to its own citizens when it ends up, by intent or by happenstance or by mistake, propping up a terror organization that is bringing harm to those citizens?
It's not phrased as a matter of duty to one's citizens in international law, but there are provisions of international law. There are treaties, there are Security Council resolutions that say that it is unlawful to provide any form of support to a terrorist organization, even passive support. And that means that when Israel gives aid, even humanitarian aid, to the Gaza Strip that's under the control of Hamas, knowing that Hamas is going to steal some of this aid, that it's going to use this aid to support its fighters and to extort Palestinian civilians, to use the supplies themselves and the suppliers as human shields. When Israel does this, it's violating the laws against material support for terrorism. It's not just that Israel is not required to give such aid, it is required to not give such aid. Now, I can't hold Israel too much, to hold its feet too much to the fire on this. Israel's being extorted. It's not doing this of its free will. It's very clear that there's an enormous amount of pressure on Israel from the Biden administration, from other actors that purport to be helping the Palestinians, even though they're really helping Hamas. Yeah, as far as international law is concerned, Israel should not be doing this. And it's unfortunate that Israel is being extorted in this way.
And my last question that I didn't intend to ask you, but I'm going to. You are a professor of law at Ilan University, as we said at the top of the briefing, and you're also a professor of law at University of California, Santa Barbara.
No. University of San Diego.
San Diego, my mistake. Thank you for the correction. At University California, San Diego. Is that right?
University of San Diego. The University of California, San Diego does not have a law school.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the correction. So you're at University of San Diego as a professor of law. You are there at a time of tremendous tumult on campuses. We've seen that many campuses, from the grassroots, being the students, all the way up to the professors and even the head of the administrations, are rotten, absolutely rotten when it comes to the subject of Israel. No surprise there. But just in terms of legal teaching and legal discourse, what are the attitudes on the campus in the law school over there in the United States as you're seeing them?
Well, the U.S. Academy, and this is not a matter of law schools, this is a matter of all universities and all colleges, have a very serious problem with anti-Semitism. This is not new. This has unfortunately been around for a while. And unfortunately, it's linked to anti-Semitism among political progressives, which is the dominant movement on almost all university campuses in the United States. And the progressive have steadily adopted a mixture of victim politics and identity politics that defines Jews as oppressors and defines those who victimize Jews as victims, and punishes not only Jews, anyone who has the temerity to speak up in favor of Jews. Now, that said, I have to say that the University of San Diego, this is actually important. The University of San Diego is not a state university. It's a Catholic school. And one of the remarkable and I think wonderful things that's happened in the wake of the Hamas atrocities in October is that there are a number of Catholic schools that have stepped forward to announce that they will be doing their very best to invite and protect Jewish students from the wave of anti-Semitism that's going around elsewhere in the academy. So while I can't say that my university is perfect, I can say that there are places in the United States where there are there's little pockets of light.
Mm-hmm. You know I said that I was going to let you go, but I'm going to push it once more, and then we're going to slide over to Yaakov Lappin and David Hacham. There's now this reporting aspect of the ICJ's findings or of their decision, which is that the Israel Defense Forces must report certain activities, certain actions, and almost prove and reprove again and again that they're not in the midst of committing genocide, as though we needed instruction from anybody, anywhere, ever. Can you tell us what that process is likely to look like? How cumbersome is that going to be with regard to the Israel Defense Forces Military Advocate General's Corps, the IDF MAG Corps?
There's an operative part of the order of the interim measures by the ICJ that requires Israel to police the speech of political figures in Israel and to report back after 30 days to the ICJ that it's not committing genocide and that it's taking steps to provide humanitarian aid to Hamas-controlled Gaza and a variety of other things. And I think it's very clear that Israel will be making a terrible, terrible mistake if it obeyed this order. Israel must not report anything to the ICJ. It's simply feeding the anti-Israel narrative that the ICJ is promoting together with the South African Hamas. And it's inserting the ICJ into a role that's very dangerous in Israel's conflict. We can only imagine what it will be like when Israel has to make war decisions and a lawyer is standing in the corner and saying, wait, I'm going to have to report this to the ICJ. So I think that it would be a grave mistake to comply with this order. Israel must not report. Now, just one last thing. I have to excuse myself because I'm at the University of San Diego and I have to teach. I'm going to take myself off this program now. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. We'll move on to our next speakers, and thanks for educating us, Avi Bell. All the very best.
Thank you.
And we're going to move on to Yaakov and to David Hacham. Yaakov, I'm going to start where we left off with Avi, if I may. What do you think are any of the operational implications, such as they may or may not be, of the ICJ's ruling that Israel must report its activities as it carries out the military operation inside the Gaza Strip? Do you think that will impede, inhibit? Do you think it will be complied with? Avi there was just saying very, very clearly that it ought not to be complied with. What do you think operationally? And then I'll come to David.
I think operationally will have no effect whatsoever because the inner workings of the IDF are based on a very close internal directive and accompanying of that directive by the IDF's own legal officers to ensure, and not for any external reason, but because this is part of the IDF's own code of ethics, that all operations are in line with international law, with Israeli law, with the international laws of warfare, and that it means principles of distinction between civilians and terrorists or combatants. That means proportionality, where the military target has to be proportionate in regards to the potential collateral damage. All of these things are accompanied by the IDF's own legal officers. And when it comes to, choosing pre-selected targets, the legal officers are on that round table, giving their opinions, and their opinion has a lot of weight. And when it comes to real-time targets, when there isn't time to have that kind of discussion, the officer in command, the commanders, will be versed in what the law allows them and what it does not, according to this IDF interpretation of the law, and they will act accordingly. So this ruling will have no effect whatsoever. The IDF doesn't need anybody to tell it how to comply with the laws of a war. The IDF, in my opinion, goes further than any military in the world, considerably, in complying with those principles.
Okay, thanks, Yaakov. We're going to have much more with you as we continue with this conversation. I also want to say to the audience, if you want to ask a question, you can type it in the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom interface. Feel free to do that. I want to bring in David Hacham. David, I've got a question right off the bat. Just before we went live, I saw reports that there is a potential hostage deal that is taking form. And what's new about the hostage deal that's taking form is that there is no demand by Hamas for a total ceasefire, but nor is there any stipulation by Israel that it will withdraw from the Gaza Strip. So these are two somewhat new elements, dimensions to the negotiations. And this plan, which is nowhere close to coming to full fruition, this was put forward by the Egyptians and the Qataris together. What do you make of this? It would entail a number of other things, but it's interesting that these two aspects, no ceasefire and no full withdrawal by Israel from each respective side, those are not demands currently being pushed.
Yes, listen, first of all, we are in the very initial stages of the new deal for the release of the Israeli hostages held by Hamas, of course, inside Gaza, inside the underground tunnels. So first of all, I think that we shouldn't give a lot of importance to all the leaks coming out of the negotiations between Israel and Hamas, the indirect negotiations. I think we have to wait and see until something, is going to be published in this regard in a formal, official way, because right now we are speaking only about leaks, not authorized and not, real issues when we are speaking about the negotiations between Israel and Hamas via Qatar and Egypt. We have to wait and see until the real stuff, the real issues are going to be published and to be released to the press. As of now, you have to take into consideration that Hamas is very much stubborn in one, as you have said before, in one basic demand, which is the final acts of war by Israel is going to be taking place in Gaza. This is a very,
Do you mean they're stubborn on their desire for complete ceasefire?
For a complete ceasefire by Israel to complete the war, in a very sharp way, not to continue the war. And at the same time, at the same breath, they are speaking about the demand for the withdrawal of the Israeli forces from Gaza, Israeli military forces, to the border between Israel and Gaza, and not to be inside Gaza. I don't know whether there is like a change in the Hamas, demands and positions. In accordance to what I see in the Palestinian press, Hamas is still stubborn in terms of asking for a full, withdrawal of Israel, the Israeli forces from Gaza, and a cessation of the war, and not continuing the war inside Gaza against Hamas. These are two basic demands by Hamas. At the same time, there is a possibility for, trying to be more soft in terms of the conditions. And I said it time and again in the past, I think as long as Israel is going to continue the military pressure being exerted or carried out against Hamas, basically I'm speaking about the Gaza, the Khan Yunis area. And you have to take into consideration, Benjamin, that in accordance to all our information, intelligence information, the area in which the leaders of Hamas, and I'm speaking about the three main prominent leaders of Hamas in Gaza, which are Marwan Isa, Muhammad Deif, and Yahya Sinwar. By the way, two of them, Yahya Sinwar and Muhammad Deif, were born in Khan Yunis refugee camp. You know this. So this is the area in which we call the basic, the natural area of these two leaders of Hamas. But I'm saying when the military pressure is going to come very close to these leaders, this is the time in which I think they are going to be more soft in terms of presenting to Israel conditions for the release of kidnapped Israeli people.
And I should have said this at the top of the program, David, and Yaakov, stay with us because we're going to delve deeper and deeper into this issue as our time progresses here. David, you're one of the foremost experts on this issue. You were the advisor to 7 Israeli ministers of defense on Arab affairs. You are also somebody who's been very engaged directly with targeted assassinations, including some of the most well-known targeted assassinations that took place with regard to Hamas. What I want to ask you is, following on from what you just said, if it's true, and you're right, we shouldn't give too much credence to the idea that there is a hostage deal and that we know the terms of the deal. You're absolutely right to counsel that we should wait and see. But I do want to ask something based on knowledge that is far from absolutely certain and finalized. You said something very interesting. If the pressure is ratcheted up on where those 3 leaders of Hamas are, you might see a softening of their terms. And the absence of the demand in the mooted deal that Israel brings about a ceasefire immediately would imply, based on your theory, that the pressure is being ratcheted up, that the IDF is closing in on these individuals. Do you think that operationally that's the case? Do you think that there is more and more pressure, not only that we know of, but also that they know and that they recognize and understand that their time may be coming to a close?
Yeah, you are perfectly right. I think that they know that Israel is going until the end. Listen very carefully. I've heard time and again our Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu speaking in the last couple of days, saying we are going in the war against Hamas until the end. At the same time, at the same breath, of course, if there will be some, chance to release Israeli hostages, of course, Israel will continue negotiations indirectly with Hamas in order to release as many hostages as we can. But at the same time, I think the main issue now is to continue the war, not to have any, kind of questions whether to continue or not. We have to continue until the end and to exert pressures to carry out the military campaign, the military operation against Hamas. We are now doing it in the area of Khan Yunis, the city and the refugee camp, in which, in accordance to our, intelligence information, the leaders of Hamas are hidden there in underground tunnels. We have to continue the war, to continue the military pressure, because this is, Benjamin, the key in order to arrive at the end of the day to a new deal as regard to the release of the hostages. This is the key, because otherwise they will continue with now rejecting, of course, resisting to any kind of negotiations with the state of Israel. I think this is the key here, in order to press upon Hamas to come to terms with Israel in order to have a new deal for the release of the Israeli hostages.
Thank you, David. Let me turn to Yaakov for a moment. I'll come back to you. Yaakov, David's just said so much there. There are a number of points. I'd like to begin by asking you, can you tell me, there are 2 major objectives that have been iterated and reiterated by the Prime Minister, those being the destruction of Hamas and also, Yaakov, the return of the hostages. And then that order has been inverted. It's been said that we need to return the hostages and destroy Hamas. As far as you're aware, does one of those priorities supersede the other?
It depends on the timeline that you're looking at. The destruction of Hamas as a terrorist army and as a regime, a political regime, is going to be a long-term affair that will actually end up going on for years, because the kind of jihadist entity that Hamas is, it's built to operate even at the levels of cells. If the cells lose their command structure, they can still fight. They can enter this guerrilla warfare mode. And because we're so far away from this, 1967 six-day victory era, and because this has to be a long-term fight, day in and day out with raids, and we can look at Operation Defensive Shield as the example, as the precedent. It took more than 4 years to stabilize levels of terrorism after the IDF retook the cities of the West Bank. And these are the kinds of timelines that we're looking at, I think, in the long term. And so the destruction of Hamas and making sure that it does not rebuild is going to be a constant for Israel. And the attempt to set up a deal actually does go hand in hand with that, because first of all, in the whole of the Gaza Strip, in the north, in the center, in the south, every day that passes, Hamas loses more and more capabilities. Even if in northern Gaza and central Gaza, it's no longer a high-intensity war, there are still divisions operating. There are 3 divisions operating throughout the Gaza Strip, and every day that passes, they are destroying Hamas command centers, Hamas field operatives. More than 50% of Hamas's fighting force is very likely off the battlefield, either because they've been killed or they've been injured. And so that's ongoing. And every day that continues, Yehia Sinwar, Mohammed Def, the head of the military wing, his deputy, Marwan Issa, they're all going to understand that time is not on their side. And meanwhile, in southern Gaza, as David has been, describing, the pressure is going to be building. They're going to start, sensing that special forces are closing in on them. We've had special forces operating in the tunnels of Khan Yunis for several weeks. They must have a fairly good intelligence picture of what's going on down there, probably, where Sinwar is, where the hostages are. Now, here's where the problem is. We do have a problem and a sort of paradox that we have yet to solve. First of all, as far as Hamas is concerned, the survival of its leadership is paramount because they equate that survival with the survival of the jihad. And their entire game plan is to survive this war so that they can declare victory and they can rebuild. That's their entire strategy going forward. And so that's why this round of negotiations has so far been stuck, because they have rejected every single Israeli offer that has the words temporary truce in it. And they've demanded a permanent truce. They've demanded a full withdrawal of the IDF from the Gaza Strip. These are all completely divorced from reality, these demands. And yet they have not retreated from these demands, because that's the most important thing for them right now. And only, the sense that time is not on their side could cause them to retreat from that kind of demand. And that's why these two objectives continue to go hand in hand, but it won't be like the first round where Hamas said to itself, okay, let's go for a temporary truce, and then we'll see if we can make the dynamics of that turn into a permanent truce. Now, Sinwar has internalized the fact that Israel is completely serious and committed to the goal of destroying him, his leadership, and that's why he's so wary of this temporary truce. And that's why this is a much more difficult phase in the negotiations, and we have to see whether the military pressure will in fact cause him to soften his position.
David, I've got a question for you from one of the listeners, Mike, and he asks about the need for us to gain complete control of the Rafah crossing.
Yes.
And to close the Egyptian border, from which the armaments have been supplied to Hamas.
Yes.
How high on Israel's operational priority set should that achievement be placed at this time? It seems to me there's no way that we can bring about security inside the Gaza Strip, and more importantly, for our citizens who live adjacent to the Gaza Strip, without taking control of that area. You surely agree?
I agree with you 100%, Benjamin. I'll tell you frankly, today an article of mine was published in Ma'ariv newspaper in Israel about this very issue, about the need of Israel to do it in a very short time, to take control over what we call Philadelphia line, which is the borders between the Arab Republic of Egypt, between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. And this is a must move that has to be taken by Israel. And I think, listen carefully to what I'm saying, I think it was a mistake taken by Israel at the beginning of the war, of not in the first days of the war against Hamas in Gaza, that the IDF didn't take control over Philadelphia line. It's a big mistake. Because right now, I think, again, I'm telling you now in principle, Israel has to take over Philadelphia line. This is a static line. This is the place in which through underground tunnels, arms, ammunition, rockets, military equipment are being smuggled from the Egyptian side to the Palestinian side, to Hamas. And at the same time, there are underground tunnels in which they can be used by Hamas in order to smuggle. Listen carefully, even kidnapped Israeli people, hostages, from the Palestinian side in Gaza to the Egyptian side, to Hamas, to jihadi, groups operating in Sinai. And this is a big, big, nightmare, I think, for us as Israelis.
David, don't you think the Egyptians would be able to detect that, or do you think that they would not see that?
I'll tell you frankly, Yaakov, I don't rely on the Egyptians. I don't rely on the Egyptians. I tell you frankly, Sinai is a very broad, big area. And there are many, many, subversive, organizations operating in Sinai. And there is a possibility that kidnapped people, hostages, will be smuggled through the underground tunnels to the Egyptian side and being taken by Hamas or by jihadi organizations in Sinai. And this is something which is, for me, like a nightmare. At the same time, I must tell you, today, it's not an easy job to be done, to be implemented by the IDF, by the Israeli Defense Forces. I mean, taking control over Philadelphia line. Why? Because I don't know if you are familiar with the facts. Today, there are more than 1 million Palestinians which fled, which ran away from the northern part of Gaza to the southern part of Gaza. And they are very much close now to Rafah area, to the Philadelphia line. I remember, like, more than 30 years ago, I was many times in Philadelphia line, but it was, an empty area, almost no houses. And it was only a sandy area, very short, I would say, wall, separating between the Egyptian side and the Palestinian side. But now the situation is totally different because more than 1 million Palestinians are located in this area. And in order to take control over Philadelphia line, now Israel has, or the IDF have, to take the population now, the Palestinian population, out of the area of Rafah in order to take control. And this is why I'm saying it was a big mistake.
I understand, David, but let's talk about that. You've made it very clear that it was a big mistake, and it's actually a big mistake that predates by many, many, many years the atrocities of October the 7th. The control and interdicting and putting a stop to the smuggling and the trade and the weaponizing that went into the Gaza Strip via the Philadelphia corridor, via the Rafah crossing, is not something that we should have tolerated for as long as we did. And with regard to the 1 million Palestinians who are down in that area at this time, this goes back to something that I asked Avi Bell, professor of law, about. Let us not forget that however complex it is, Israel's primary duty is to secure its citizens and its civilians. And if taking control of that area is a prerequisite for doing so, then unfortunately that is what will have to be done. And I can tell you, having seen the successes of the Israeli Defense Forces operating not only in a manner that has brought about great military success, but also in a manner in which I take the deepest pride in terms of the moral code by which we operate. And I have absolutely no concerns about the moral code of any soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces. It's quite remarkable, for example, that with the media reportings from the Gaza Strip, there are absolutely no reports whatsoever of acts of vengeance or acts of terror against innocents or civilians inside the Gaza Strip. No one's hearing anything of that, despite the atrocities that were visited upon us on October 7th. There is no testimony of any atrocities being perpetrated by any member of the defense forces against any innocent civilians inside the Gaza Strip that would constitute depraved acts of vengeance. And because I've seen those dual successes, the operational success, David, and the adherence to our own moral code, which incidentally supersedes the standard of the laws of armed conflict, I'm very confident that despite the complexity that you rightly highlight, in order to secure our citizens in the long term, the Israel Defense Forces is absolutely up to the task of taking hold of the Rafah crossing, and it should do so deliberately and swiftly. Incidentally, on the note of the refugees, the Palestinian Arab refugees, it's an incredible inversion of the typical attitudes of the international community. When you look, for example, at the fact that Germany was applauded for taking in 1 million refugees from Syria, and Turkey took in refugees from Syria, and Poland took in refugees from Ukraine. Only when it comes to the state of Israel is the notion of taking refugees seen as some sort of war crime. The Egyptians should be opening that border. They should be compelled to open that border by way of international pressure. And those Palestinian Arab refugees, some of them, should be going into the Sinai Peninsula. I really believe that that's necessary. And it's what we see happen in conflicts all around the world. Of course, the premise of the campaign inside the Gaza Strip by the IDF is very distinct from what caused the refugee situation in Ukraine, into Poland and Syria, into Turkey and over to Germany. But I'm focusing on the refugee issue as I speak to that.
Listen, you are, in principle, of course, you are right, but I must tell you in this regard that we are speaking about a very complex and sensitive situation. In addition to what I've said before, Benjamin, that there are more than 1 million Palestinians, displaced Palestinians, which are gathering today in the area of Rafah. At the same time, you have to take into consideration the Egyptian position. And in this regard, of course, it's a very, crucial issue now to know what Egypt is saying about the Israeli deployment, military deployment along Philadelphia line. And the Egyptians, Benjamin, are totally against the deployment of the IDF along Philadelphia line.
David, let me just challenge you here.
This loud and clear. You have to understand this. And this is why, by the way,
very clearly, but I
must tell you something very important.
Okay, you say that.
The Ministry of Defense until now didn't take this decision to deploy the Israeli forces along Philadelphia line because of the sensitivities of the relations with Egypt. This is fact of life.
I understand.
But at the same time, I agree with you. Israel has to work very hard vis-a-vis the Egyptians in order to explain the importance of Israel being in control of the Philadelphia line. This is like, I think, a very crucial job of the Israeli government today, even of the prime minister vis-a-vis Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the president of Egypt, to explain what does it mean to have control by the IDF along Philadelphia line.
David,
because I'll tell you here in this regard,
one moment, because I need to come to Yaakov in just a second, because I want to talk to him about this issue. But let me just respond to you about the issue with the Egyptians. Of course it's complex. The pressure, incidentally, that you say the Israelis should be bringing to bear, or the explanations that the Israelis ought to be bringing to bear, I actually think is more the work of the Americans. The Americans have done a fine job of instructing and pressuring Israel when it comes to funneling humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip because of the humanitarian issue attendant that. Surely the Americans should be doing an equally fine job of expressing the humanitarian duty of the Egyptians to let the refugees into the Sinai Peninsula. It cannot be one rule for Israel and one rule for everybody else. And the second point that I would say to you, David, is the Egyptians are culpable in part for what took place on October 7th because of the blind eye that they deliberately or passively took to the smuggling of contraband into the Gaza Strip that has been fired upon and deployed towards our citizens and our civilians. They cannot, on the one hand, say, we will not allow the Israel Defense Forces to take hold of this crossing area, and on the other hand, be the party, one of the main parties responsible for the sustained smuggling of weapons and materiel that is being combated now by our soldiers in the Israel Defense Forces, and in the process of which our soldiers are dying and coming home in body bags. Surely they can't have it both ways. So I know about the complexity. You're right to highlight it, as ever you are. And I reiterate, for those who don't know, David is one of the preeminent global experts on this issue.
I just wanted to jump on this
Yaakov, you
exchange
jump in and tell me where we're right or wrong, please.
I actually really want to get into Sisi's head for a moment and go behind the headlines, because I feel like there's a lot of posturing and posing by Egypt on this issue. But David, what I'd love to know is, behind, closed doors, is Sisi afraid of Israel taking Philadelphia because this could cause a mass exodus into Sinai, including Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas elements that he fears would link up with Islamists in Egypt, or is he scared of the way it would look? Is he scared of being called a collaborator? Because public opinion is obviously so hostile against us in Egypt, with Al-Hazar and the Islamists who are in any case fighting al-Sisi. Can you just take us into his head for a moment about how he sees this threat?
First of all, he doesn't want to be related to, in the Arab world, as a traitor, who is cooperating with the state of Israel. And at the same time, he doesn't want to see a flow of tens of thousands of Palestinians via Rafah checkpoint to the Egyptian side. And as a matter of fact, there are big differences of opinion between Israel and Egypt as regard to what we call in Hebrew the day after, Hayom She'achrei, the day after the war, of who is going to take control and to lead Gaza after the end of the war of Israel inside Gaza. And in this regard, I must tell you that we have differences of opinion with the United States of America and with Egypt at the same time.
Because they want
Egypt
the PA?
Sorry?
They want the PA, the Egyptians? In
the Egyptians
Gaza?
want the PA to come back, to return to Gaza, and to be in control and responsible for the life inside Gaza and the security in Gaza. At the same time, I must tell you that the United States of America are speaking loudly that they want the Palestinian Authority, a new version of the Palestinian Authority, to come back to Gaza. And this is totally unacceptable by the state of Israel, by the Israeli government. I will say more than this, and to be more accurate, by Prime Minister Netanyahu. He is totally against. If you heard what he said during the last couple of days, some declarations about what will happen in Gaza after the end of the war, he spoke very explicitly and very clearly. He said Israel has to be with full security control over Gaza. And he said time and again, Israel must control the Philadelphia line. I'll tell you frankly, I said this at the beginning of the war, and I was very happy, I'm telling you, to hear this from the Israeli Prime Minister, saying this time and again during the last couple of weeks. And I think at the end of the day, we are going to have some misunderstanding, some, I don't want to say quarrels, but vikuchim, arguments with the United States of America. They are speaking very, very sharply about the fact that they want the Palestinian Authority, a new kind of a Palestinian Authority, to take control over Gaza. And what is the situation today of the Palestinian Authority? We are closing the end of the turn of the period of time of Mahmoud Abbas as the president of the Palestinian Authority. The security, bodies of the Palestinian Authority are very weak. They are not doing their job. As a matter of fact, they are cooperating with Hamas inside the West Bank against the Israeli presence, military presence. And this is something which is like, for me, it's like something in the air, in the sky, to bring the Palestinian Authority to be responsible over Gaza.
Right. So everybody's posturing and striking a certain posture and position, basically at the expense of Israel's core security interests and covering their own backs. And that's based on what you're saying. My understanding is that Israel will absolutely need to be very firm and make sure that its own security interests are going to be taken care of, because there's nobody else left to promote those interests except Israel itself.
Exactly.
And
You are right, Yaakov. You are perfectly right. I'm saying time and again, you cannot buy security from other, third forces. Security you have to implement by yourself. And in this case, Israel has to be the master of security, of its security inside Gaza. I'm not saying, in order to be clear, cut and clear for the audience to understand my position, I'm not saying that Israel is now going to be forever in the Gaza Strip. I'm saying that after the war...
Why not, by the way? Hang on, I want to interject for a moment. Why aren't you saying that? Why can't you say that? There seems to be... Just again, let me broaden out the question, and then I'm actually going to ask you for a short response, and I want to get some final operational aspects with Yaakov and you as well. And just for our audience, please keep on typing in your questions. I'm seeing them. I'm going to find a moment to ask some of them, and we're going to run to for another 20 minutes here. So let's try and do this sharply and succinctly. Why does the international community, who will not have any requirement whatsoever to live with the outcome of the policies that it promotes, such as the ridiculous idea of a two-state solution, or such as the absurd and ridiculous and completely inappropriate tone-deaf notion that we're going to now ask the Palestinian Authority that is somehow going to be renewed, improved, revised, and we're going to get a Mark II moderate version of this organization that, I remind you, was murdering Jews until it was fenced off from doing so by way of suicide bombings by the security barrier that separates Israel from Judea and Samaria, and that when it was in power for a brief period inside the Gaza Strip, it was very swiftly destroyed, that power, by Hamas, which now has come and murdered 1,200 of our citizens on October the 7th. Why does the international community, David, have the right to make these suggestions, but Israel, which will have to live with the consequences of the policies that are implemented, is forbidden from considering even the notion that we will permanently have a security presence inside the Gaza Strip? Because I'll say something now. As long as you have a mindset inside the Gaza Strip that is sympathetic towards and even supportive of and even promotes and even finds itself ready to be recruited to ideologies such as Hamas, make no mistake about it, you are going to have to permanently handle that issue. And to underscore your point, that handling of that issue can only be done effectively by the powers of the state of Israel. Surely it's legitimate to talk about as permanently remaining as the security enforcer of the Gaza Strip. I don't know why we have to add caveats such as, I'm not saying in permanence, I'm not saying in perpetuity. Why can we not say that?
Listen very much carefully. I mean, first of all, I agree with you that everybody has the legitimacy to speak as he wants about the solutions and about what will be in the future. I only want to remind you, Benjamin, what happened in 2005. I don't know if you remember the decision taken by the late Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon to withdraw unilaterally from Gaza. I mean, without any agreement, one-sidedly from one side to withdraw from Gaza. And this was a big mistake taken by Ariel Sharon. And I would like to remind you that the government of Israel, even today, is not united in one, position vis-a-vis the future, vis-a-vis the solution of the Palestinian problem. I mean, there are in the cabinet that are speaking about that Israel is to come back to Gaza and to control Gaza. And there are those who are saying that Israel is to be outside Gaza, to continue to be outside Gaza after the war. I mean, there are, differences of opinion inside the Israeli government. And until today, by the way, despite what we have heard during the last couple of weeks from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, there is no one, I would say, approved line position by the Israeli government as regard to the future situation inside Gaza after the war.
David, I'm
I
going
mean,
to
there's
cut
no
from you to Yaakov, and I want to,
okay,
because you've
there is
just
only one sentence.
please.
There is no decision by the Israeli government.
So you've
No
highlighted
decision.
highlighted a very important issue that I want us to talk about. There were 24 soldiers killed last week, 21 of whom were killed in a particularly local incident, a local tragedy that took place about 600 meters from Israel's border with the Gaza Strip. Now, Yaakov, that incident highlighted a goal that the Israeli government seems to be in the throes of implementing. And David, this is where you say there is no one view. This seems to be part of every view coming from Israel. And that is that there needs to be a buffer zone, approximately 1 kilometer in length, between Israel's border and the Gaza Strip, and that Israel is in the throes of demolishing anything and everything that falls currently within this buffer zone. They've demolished 1,072 of 2,824 structures that are 1 kilometer or less from the border, in the area of the border that's close to Khan Yunis down in the south. Though Khan Yunis is obviously further inland. And roughly 67% of the structures have been cleared along the border parallel to that area. So, Yaakov, that seems to be a central goal of Israel, to have this buffer zone. Do you think that will be implemented? And it goes back to what David said that I just challenged David on, and I'll leave our audience to decide where they fall on this question. Israel is in the midst of doing that, but there's an argument about whether or not Israel will stay there permanently or whether it's a temporary measure. Can you tell us about the importance of that buffer zone, please, Yaakov, not only now, but also in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, it's interesting to note, as David exactly just said, that the government hasn't announced any buffer zone. I would actually call it a kill zone, because I think
explain what you mean by kill zone for our audience, please, if you would. And you're right to highlight this point about the government not announcing it, but it does seem to be discussed.
It seems to be underway. It seems to be happening de facto. And in security concepts, you have a holding area. This is the area that you want to defend. And then if it's threatened consistently, you don't want the enemy right on the border, because that means that their first step will be into the holding area, the area that you're trying to defend. So then you set up, essentially, we can call it a buffer zone, you can call it a kill zone, but it's a zone in which you make sure that the enemy does not enter into, and that the minute it does, you have the time to identify and take out the enemy. And that's what gives you this advance warning. This is exactly what was missing on October 7th, because they were all along the border, the Nukhba elite Hamas unit. As soon as they took their first step, their first attack, they were already in Israeli territory. So that's already the failure. And the whole idea of this kill zone, which appears to be taking shape without any official directive as of now, is to never again allow that to happen. So we are seeing those structures demolished, as you've so rightly said. And it appears to be that this is going to be a permanent new feature of Gaza. A kilometer from the Israeli border, there will be no Gazans living. There are also farming areas. I don't think they're going to be active either, from at least from what it looks like on the ground. And I think we can probably expect perimeters to be set up there, multiple perimeters, not just one. I think that's realistic. In addition to a huge concrete wall that I think Israel is going to be building along the border itself. Behind that, in the Gazan territory, I think there'll be multiple perimeters. We also have the underground barrier against the tunnels, which is the only thing, I'll remind everybody, that actually held up on October 7th. Not a single terrorist managed to get into Israel on that horrific day through cross-border underground tunnels. Only overground and over it, and also through the sea, of course, but not underground. So I think we are seeing a re-engineering of the Gaza Strip in line with this Israeli desire to set up a kill zone. And the kill zone means anybody who enters it after being warned, the whole population, anybody who enters that zone is going to be considered an enemy, a threat, and they will be taken out. No ifs, no buts, no questions. That's the definition of a kill zone. And I think that's apparently what's taking shape. That's what it looks like right now. It looks like it's taking shape.
And just so that everybody understands this, the discord between the Israeli view of this, now that it is being discussed, and the American view of this is that Israel is saying, well, we will keep that for an undetermined but temporary period of time. And the Americans are saying that they have no reason to believe that Israel would withdraw from that area under any circumstances at any point in the future, and that it is effectively a permanent encroachment onto Gazan territory. I'm just giving you some of the diplomatic background there. Let's talk about a couple of final topics. David Hacham, I've said this since long before October 7th. It's one of the reasons that I didn't greet the Abraham Accords with the jubilation that everybody else did. I don't know that the Abraham Accords were as durable as everybody wanted to believe that they were. Time will tell. But I think, as I've said in prior podcasts, that normalization agreements are sort of like newborn human infants. They're very cute and cuddly and wonderful when they're first born, but they become a bit more complicated as they age, particularly as they reach teenage years. There are statements now from a senior UAE official who has not been identified that have expressed that the normalization agreements, which are currently described as warm between Israel and the UAE, may well cool as the conflict inside the Gaza Strip rages on. Do you think that that's likely?
Listen, first of all, everything is likely in the future. Nobody has, cannot be responsible for any deeds by the UAE in the future. But for the time being, I'm not so much in agreement with what you have said before as regard to the situation of our relations with the United Arab Emirates.
Okay.
I think that to a large extent, Benjamin, despite all the crises that were in the last period of time, basically I'm speaking in the last issue of the war against Hamas in Gaza, we didn't see any move, any protest taken by the United Arab Emirates vis-a-vis the state of Israel. We didn't see anything which is very sharp, very aggressive.
I agree.
I agree
with that.
In terms of the policy of the UAE.
I'm wondering, is this the
contrary,
turning point, David? Is this senior UAE official, and I agree with everything you've just said, is this senior UAE official putting us on this and letting us be aware, helping us to be aware of the fact that they may start to change the attitude as this draws on?
Yeah, this is, I think, something that we have to take into consideration. Because as long as the war is going to be continued in the future for more months, and as Yaakov said before, maybe years, this is something that can harm the relations, the peaceful relations between Israel and the UAE. And this is something that we have to be very aware of. And I think that we have to use the American services, the American administration, in order to see that no crisis, no, shaking in the relations are going to be taken place. And I think that to a large extent, until now, I see that despite the war and despite the casualties in the Palestinian side, and despite all the propaganda, and despite all what Hezbollah is doing, etc., still the relations are stable between Israel and the UAE. And I say more than that, between Israel and Bahrain. Pay attention. We have common ground as regard to what is going with the Houthis in Yemen. They are in the same coalition, Bahrain against the Houthis. And this is something, of course, that we have to take into consideration and to be very much careful in order to be in touch with the American administration to see that no harm is going to take place in this regard.
David, I spoke earlier about the horror of what is brought across the Philadelphia crossing from Egypt into Gaza. There has been a report here today that we've all seen that many of the munitions that are being fired upon Israelis by Hamas are actually Israeli munitions that have been stolen or repurposed by Hamas. And it seems that we have not been sufficiently vigilant on our borders, in some cases, on our bases, in the context of ensuring that our supplies are secured. Are you shocked by the fact that so many of these munitions seem to have been sourced and taken and smuggled from Israel?
A lot of them are unexploded
Listen,
munitions, I would just add. As a
Unexploded. Thank you very much.
It fell in Gaza.
Let's add on to that, Yaakov. So you're right to highlight that. Many of these munitions are unexploded munitions that have been fired into the Gaza Strip and that have been repurposed and then fired back toward the state of Israel. But there is nonetheless this smuggling, stealing of weapons and munitions. There are testimonies from soldiers and civilians who saw on the Hamas terrorists as they stormed into the Gaza Strip munitions with Israeli writing on them, even munitions that were Israel designed, even recently Israeli designed. David, are you surprised by this? Are you shocked by this?
I don't want to say shocked, but I'm a little bit surprised. Listen, the phenomenon of taking Israeli munition from bases, this is something that we know for many years. Done, basically, I'm speaking about Palestinians and Israeli Arabs, that they are entering to Israeli bases in order to take this munition. But when you are speaking about smuggling this ammunition to Hamas inside Gaza, this is something which is very, worried me that we saw this phenomenon that munition is coming to Hamas in order to be used against the Israeli side. And I thought that the majority of the munition, the arms, the military equipment, etc., are coming vis-a-vis the underground tunnels along Philadelphia line from the Egyptian side, and take into consideration the local manufacturing, the local military industry of Hamas inside Gaza.
Which is where most of the weapons are coming from
as well.
These days.
Sorry?
Yeah. Which is where most of the weapons that are used by Hamas are coming from these days.
Exactly.
So Yaakov, let me give the final question to you. We're not going to get to the Northern Front on this situational briefing. We'll do that next time. I want to talk about the fact that it's been announced that the IDF will be reinforcing, increasing its activities in central and northern Gaza. What are we to read into that?
So just before I weigh in on that, I just want to say something about the Abraham Accords. I just would want to point out that the enemies of Saudi Arabia, which is not an official signatory, but they could never have gone ahead without Saudi Arabia's blessing, the enemies of the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Bahrainis are, of course, the Iranians and their proxies and the Islamists. And, behind the scenes, I think the more decisive Israel's military performance will be, the more robust the Abraham Accords will be. One of the reasons that they were pushed into our arms, so to speak, was because they saw us as a regional strongman who could help them against Iran. They are stuck in the mud under the threat of Iran and its proxies. It's a direct threat to their existence and their stability and their plans for prosperity. And so Israel's recovery is actually going to be the thing, in my view, that makes sure that the Abraham Accords will remain. And the more strength and power that Israel is able to project in its recovery, the better those relations will be. That's just my thought on that. Look, regarding the Gaza Strip, again, I think we need to take the long-term view of this. Yes, there are going to be ups and downs. Northern Gaza, Gaza City, everybody who has been there says the same thing. There's very little left. There's very little left of what was Gaza City. The IDF has deployed tremendous amounts of firepower to destroy. And, the reason there's so little left is because almost every building was used by Hamas as a military post. The tunnels were everywhere. The civilian facilities were used as military terrorist, sites, storage facilities, rocket production, RPGs, command centers. So it's obvious that the IDF tried to make sure that the Hamas terrorists would have very little to go back to. And of course, we're going to see them try to rebuild. That's how they are designed. They're designed to try to come back and rebuild. And this is going to be a whack-a-mole type of situation going forward. I think this is actually what's going to shape the next stage of the war, at least in northern Gaza, Gaza City, probably central Gaza too. Based on intelligence, they're going to try and rebuild, and then acting on that intelligence, the IDF, and it doesn't have to be a division anymore. It can be much less than that. It can be, you know, a battalion and a half that goes in and takes that threat out. It's already going to be, you know, in the area. It can come in from the Israeli border. That's the kind of future I think that we should be expecting, at least for the coming weeks and months, for most of the Gaza Strip, with the exception of southern Gaza. So this is going to be a volume button that I think is going to be, you know, turned up and down. And most of it will be intelligence fueled, and it's critical that the IDF sticks by its goal of not allowing them to rebuild, and also, in my opinion, putting on the table Israeli plans for what an autonomy will look like in Gaza. We had, you know, very little information so far. Defense Minister Gallant talked about working with local clans, but whatever the Israeli plan is, I think it needs to be on the table now, so that the people of Gaza understand that there's no reason for them to cooperate with what's left of Hamas, and in order to start recruiting, you know, these players that we talked about just now, the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Emiratis, to try and make that a viable option. So the more Israel shares what it wants, the better I think it will be for security all around.
Right. So, gentlemen, we'll have to round it out now. Thank you very much for your time. I want to thank you, Colonel David Hacham, former advisor on Arab affairs to 7 Israeli ministers of defense. You're a wonderful guest, David, because you usually begin your answers to my questions with saying, "Yes, Benjamin, you are absolutely right," and I love having guests
then
like
I'm
that.
saying the opposite.
But then you contradict me, and
but
that's
now I agree with
fine.
what Yaakov said. Just said.
There's no problem with that, and you're always welcome, and your perspective is vital, David. And Yaakov, thank you very much, our in-house analyst here at the MirYam Institute, and in his absence, of course, Professor Avi Bell, law professor at Ilan University and University of San Diego, not University of California, Santa Barbara, or University of California, San Diego, but University of San Diego. It's been a pleasure, and thank you to our listeners, and we'll be in touch again for a future situational briefing from the MirYam Institute. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benjamin,
Thank
for
you.
creating this this discussion, and for your excellent questions and moving the discussion along. Appreciate it.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Benjamin, and thank you, Yaakov.